We have reached October, and Football Insiders keeps on going like a locomotive. We will not stop until football has ended.
Yes, and even then, who knows? We might keep going because this has been so much fun.
I was going to say, we can talk about football all year long.
It is really fun, though, and especially now that some teams are done with their regular seasons.
Yep.
But we are really learning a lot about these teams, and we still don't know exactly what we're up for in the next couple weeks here.
We don't, but if there's one thing that's certain in South Dakota high school football, it was my breaking news last week that Sioux Falls Lincoln's pretty good.
Man, every week they surprise me a little bit more, and it's hard to do when they've been so dominant to be able to surprise you like that week in, week out. But I really thought Brandon Valley would have a much closer game with them, and they made it look easy, and it was almost too easy the way they were able to move the ball up and down the field.
And very easy for one Mr. Jack Smith. 6 touchdowns overall, 5 through the air, 1 on a kickoff return. And the future SDSU Jackrabbit he's made statement games before. He set the record for receptions in a game last season. This season, with the 5 touchdowns, he ties the record that Ryland Setter of O'Gorman had for most touchdown receptions in a game. But either way, this was, as we talked about on last week's Football Insiders, this was going to be the latest test for Lincoln. Brandon Valley had been playing well as of late. They were kind of hovering at the bottom part of that top 5, but we saw them improve over the course of the last couple weeks. So we thought maybe the Lynx can give them a challenge, and they just didn't. I mean, all credit in the world to Lincoln, but they just completely outmatched Brandon Valley.
And they did it. The stars obviously were on the highlights with Jack Smith's big day and Tate Schaefer, being the school record holder in passing yardage now. And then he threw 6 touchdown passes on the day, and we're talking about Jack Smith. But Tate Schaefer was pretty sharp on the day as well. But let's go to the lines. A week ago, Brandon Valley ran the ball all over Pierre, a good defensive team. And Lincoln, was able to handle that. We don't talk about how that defensive line held up.
Right.
We don't talk about how the offensive line was dominant against a really good Brandon Valley defense. Really, in all facets, this Lincoln team has got it dialed in, and the only team that can beat them is right now is if they play poorly themselves. Right now, there's not a team that can match up with them.
And you were mentioning the line play. That's what Coach Fredenberg said to you after the game, because you were out there shooting for us, and he said kind of what you just reiterated, that we know about Schaefer and Smith and Draven Hodge and Jarowski and all these great weapons, but the line play is kind of the unsung hero. They're kind of always the unsung heroes, but Coach Fredenberg made a point to shout them out after the game.
And honestly, let's talk about this Lincoln team. The last couple of years haven't been able to knock onto the door to the championship game. They've gotten to the semifinals, but it was because their line was young, and their line, they had leaders on that line, but they weren't all a cohesive group. This group has come up together through the ranks, and now I think they can make a stake that they are the top offensive line in the state. I know everybody talks about Brandon Valley's offensive line, but they could make a claim that they can play with anybody.
Lincoln with a huge win over Brandon Valley, and the offense just continues to pile on points. They scored 55. They scored 50 plus the past couple games, so they are really clicking on all cylinders, especially offensively. Some other interesting AAA scores. Jefferson kind of went through, an injury parade during their game against Rapid City Stevens. The final's 14-0, so it's another shutout for that Jefferson defense. But we had talked about the questions that the Cavs had on offense, and unfortunately, they took some hits on the offense. And
it's even harder to answer those questions when Ethan Swenson is their best quarterback. He went out due to an injury. He had to be helped off the field. We're going to see how he develops over these next couple weeks, if he's able to go or not. And then Thomas Heiberger comes in. He suffers what reportedly a concussion in that game. So they really had trouble finding guys to make that offense go smoothly. And it showed. I mean, after you see a score like that, 14-0 against a team that other AAA teams have just dominated the Stevens team, you just scratch your head and wonder, but you get a little deeper and you understand it's really hard, when you're trying to run 3 or 4 quarterbacks out in the same game to make something go. But on the bright side, that defense continues to be stout for the Cavaliers.
Yeah, and in terms of personnel that they had to use, we talked about how Thomas Heiberger, Dawson Sexer, 2 of their leading defenders, had been used kind of sparingly on offense. They didn't want them to have to play 2 ways if they could avoid it. They had to, unleash both Sexer and Heiberger on the offensive side in the win against Stevens. So we'll see what happens down the stretch here. But I agree that the Jefferson defense has always been solid. It's a question of if they can get enough offense. We'll see if Swenson misses any time or how long he misses. But if Jefferson wants to make a run, they're going to have to shore up that offense here in these next couple weeks.
And it's huge for them right now. They're right in the thick of that seeding scenario where it could be the difference between going on the road in a first round to hosting a game to possibly even getting up to that number 2 seed if things shake out their way. Some big ifs over the next couple of weeks for Jefferson. We'll see what they have in store.
O'Gorman, easy win over Washington, 45-0. Harrisburg, an easy win over Rapid City Central, 75-7. Probably the other big storyline, quote unquote, in AAA was Sioux Falls Roosevelt. We have talked about Roosevelt not being at basically full strength, full capacity for most of the season. And they go to Yankton and lose to AA Yankton.
Which, you don't want to lose to a AA team, but that's a really good AA team, and they showed some signs. They got Jackson Graven good back. Jackson Brower looked good. That's really the first time that they've played together in a really tough game this year. I think there's some signs. We've said it all year. Only 2 wins, but they have a chance now in these next couple of weeks playing Stevens and then having a year-end game where they could maybe punch their ticket to a 4-win team and could get themselves in that 4 or 5 spot. Some big question marks, but they have potential, even though they lost that game to Yankton, and a lot of credit to Yankton, too, the way Evan Sirk was able to run the ball on that defense.
Absolutely. We'll talk a little bit more about Yankton once we move to AA, but again, looking at AAA, Lincoln continues to just separate themselves from the rest of the pack, and we're going to have a little fun next week with a little compare and contrast.
People have been talking about that, how dominant Jefferson was last year, how dominant Lincoln's been this year. We've had dominant performances in AAA by the top team several times over the past decade or so since we've been covering it. Washington's had some really good teams, but it'll be interesting to compare just exactly what strength Jefferson had last year versus the strengths of Lincoln this year, and how impressive both of those teams have been.
And a lot of similarities, too, which we're going to get to next week. When we look at seeding scenarios, again, a couple weeks left in AAA. I mean, unless Lincoln falters, they're clearly going to be the number 1 seed. And so now the question is, the teams are going to be fighting, honestly, for the 3 seed and the 2 seed, because if you're on that 4 or 5 line, you're going to have to face Lincoln in the semifinals versus facing them at the Dakota Dome. So when you look at O'Gorman and Harrisburg and Jefferson and possibly Brandon Valley, the rest of the top 5, they want to try and find a way to avoid a 4 or 5 seed.
Yeah, all those teams could work their way up to a 2 or a 3 seed, which is huge. O'Gorman right now definitely has the easiest lane to get there, but they still have Harrisburg at the end of the year. And remember, Harrisburg, if they win out, and they would get that head-to-head win against O'Gorman, they would move up to 2. That would put O'Gorman at 3. But if O'Gorman gets that 2 spot, then it's a big race for number 3. At that point, Harrisburg would have 3 losses then, more than likely. And Brandon Valley, played Harrisburg. They could tie them up with 3 losses. They lost the head-to-head. So there's still a lot of scenarios that could happen here. It'll be really interesting, especially after this week, to look at those scenarios.
Yeah, when we get closer to the end, that O'Gorman-Harrisburg game, the last weekend of the regular season, it very well could be a battle of 2 versus 3. So they would both accomplish their goal of not having to face Lincoln in the semis. But then that game all of a sudden becomes if you win, you get to host the playoff rematch possibly.
And they've played each other in the playoffs now for this will be 3 years in a row that somebody will be eliminating each other in the playoffs. So it'll be interesting to see, exactly how that plays out over the next week.
In terms of game this week, we got a doubleheader on Midco Sports. Brandon Valley against Jefferson, Lincoln against Washington. That's the doubleheader at Howard Wood Field. Central's at O'Gorman, Roosevelt's at Rapid City Stevens, Harrisburg is at Brookings. Probably the most intriguing matchup is going to be that first one at Howard Wood on Friday, Brandon Valley and Jefferson.
Yeah, that's going to be huge. Right now, Jefferson with 2 losses, Brandon Valley with 3, so really important for Brandon Valley to even up their record and try to get a win against Jefferson. We know Jefferson's down a couple of players. Brandon Valley comes in, licking their wounds off a big disappointment against Lincoln, and they want to get back on track. And weather is going to be huge.
Yep, there's rain in the forecast for the rest of the week. So.
Right, rain and the high of maybe 40-something during the day. The game time temperature, who knows, could be freezing or a little above freezing during the game.
Let's move on down to AA. The big story we talked about with Yankton, we'll get to them in a second. Just want to quickly mention Pier, T, Watertown, all kind of dominant wins, kind of ho-hum wins for those 3.
Which was important for T area. For all these 3 teams, they went out to Spearfish had a dominant second quarter, ended up scoring the last, what did we say,
47 points
of the game. Huge for them to see their sophomore quarterback, Brenner Conrad, take that huge step up and really put Spearfish down. So that was huge. Pierre, we knew they could do it. Watertown did it against Mitchell, and good signs for those ranked teams.
Yeah, but as we said, Yankton over Roosevelt, which we both thought was a possibility heading into that game, and only further cements Yankton's status as the possible spoiler for Pierre's run, or attempted run of 7 straight 11 AA titles. And you mentioned it a little bit earlier, the running game with not only the backs, but with Lucas Kampshoff, who has proven to be one of the best dual threat quarterbacks in the state. The Bucks are really playing well right now.
Yeah, they've got athletes on the outside, so it's really hard to guard a quarterback like Lucas Kampshoff, who can run you over, and he did for a couple of touchdowns, but he can also pull it back and throw it as well as anybody in the state to those speedsters on the outside. So Yankton right now looking really good. They're actually tied with Pierre in seed points.
Yep.
So that's the formula they use. Of course, the tiebreaker is head-to-head, and they don't have that, but a good sign for this Yankton team.
Yep, Pierre and Yankton both 6-1. Of course, Yankton's loss was to Pierre, and Pierre's loss was to Brandon Valley a couple weeks ago. So as you mentioned, they're tied right now. In terms of other seeding issues, Watertown and T kind of fighting for that 3 spot. T, though, has the big test this week as they host Pierre.
Yeah, T area, it looks like they're ramping up at the right time. But can they knock off their rivals in Pierre? This is a huge test for both teams. I think most people expect that Pierre will go in there and be able to handle T area, but T has improved throughout this season. And when you have young players that have gotten better, I mean, that could be a real test for them.
And believe it or not, because of the wins, losses, and the seeding points, we actually already know the top 8 in 11 AA for the most part. It's just a matter of, battling in position for seeding.
Exactly.
So Aberdeen Central and Huron are going to be kind of fighting it out. Weirdly enough, Aberdeen Central and Huron are kind of battling on that 4-5 line. I don't think either one of them would mind falling to 6 if it means not having to face Pierre in the semifinals possibly.
Yeah, it'll be obviously tough, but you're right. I mean, if you're looking ahead like that, you might find a path easier to the semifinals or further in that 6th spot, but I don't think either team's worried about that too much. But it is interesting to see that Huron has a chance to maybe make a little leap here in these last couple of weeks.
Yep.
Aberdeen Central's played really well to get themselves in the middle of the pack, but have a really tough schedule over these next 2 weeks, and that could bump them down.
Yeah, Huron's got Mitchell this week, and that's a huge possibility for the Tigers, the Huron Tigers, I should say. It's a battle there. And we mentioned Pierre and T area. Yankton's at Aberdeen Central. That's going to be a good matchup. And then Watertown at Spearfish. It's a Spearfish team that has kind of disappointed us over the past couple of weeks. We'll see if they can bounce back.
Yeah, and I apologize, I should have checked on this, but I haven't seen Braden Delahoyd in the lineup, any of the highlights the last couple of weeks. I assume he's not playing. I should check to confirm that. But that's been a huge factor for them, not having one of their best players make impact plays over the last couple of weeks.
And again, we talk about seeding scenarios. We know the coaches, don't give two whats about seeding scenarios. They just want to go out and win. This is for us to discuss.
This is just for you, the fans.
For the fans and for us, that's the Football Insiders. Moving on down to 11A. Probably the biggest thing for me, the biggest surprise for me was Lennox.
Yeah.
Because we had talked about Lennox's offense being, one of the more underrated and one of the more efficient offenses, and they lose to Madison 14-8. So it's not that they just scored 8 points, but they lost to a previously winless Madison team, which had played other opponents tough. Don't get us wrong, but that's a game that Lennox might be lamenting at the end of the season.
Madison has been close. I mean, they played Canton close into the 4th quarter last week before really giving up a couple of scoring drives at the end. They were close to a couple other really highly ranked teams. But this week, they got quarterback play. They got efficient touchdowns early in the game and were able to soak up that clock. And they were able to shut down Porter Enan. I think we know Boston Catcher's been really, really tough to stop at quarterback, but he has really locked into Porter Enan from time to time this year. And Enan only had 2 catches on the game for Lennox. So I think that is a big wake-up call for the Lennox. Like, hey, if teams are able to take away this guy, how are we going to score points? And I think they'll really use some of that information this week when they have to go against another tough opponent in West Central.
And that was going to be the next point, is West Central losing at home to Winter, the cream of the crop in 11B. So you got West Central and Lennox both coming off tough losses, and they play each other this week.
Well, do you think that factor of looking ahead maybe a little bit, but I know West Central was not looking past winter for sure, but it does lend you, these high school kids were maybe looking forward to that battle in a couple weeks, and now they look forward to both coming off of losses, so they are even hungrier, not wanting to have a 2-game losing streak at this point late in the season.
And it will be West Central at Lenox on Friday. Sioux Falls Christian, after that tough start, they have now won 5 in a row. Del Rapids is the #1 team, just continues to distance themselves from the rest of the pack in terms of point differential, in terms of just dominant performances.
It's so good.
And when we look at the seeding scenarios, again, Del's is probably going to be the clear #1, but now the door opens for Canton, maybe even Sioux Falls Christian to climb up to the 2-3 spots.
Yeah, I think that will be interesting to see how those top 4, and again, you look at when you have a really dominant team like Del Rapids, you want to get out of that 4 or 5 spot if possible, and that's what Sioux Falls Christian's looking at late in the season here. Canton looking really good last week. Kane Wallner went over 300 yards rushing in the game, so after their 2 losses to the top 2 teams in the state, they continue to find a way to win, and they really want to stay in that 3 spot. But the interesting part for me is that second half, these teams like Vermilion and Madison, they probably need a win this week to get back in. And right now, Madison's out of that top 8. They would need another win over Vermilion this week to really find a way to get into that playoff field.
Yeah, I was going to say Vermilion's at Madison this week, and then Del Rapids is at St. Thomas More. So when we look again at the scope of 11A, like you said, trying to avoid that 4-5 spot. And honestly, what's interesting is Lenox had been a top 5 team. They may be falling to that 6-7 range. We just never know.
Yeah, they're tied for 5 right now, and they were really hoping maybe to get a home playoff game, which Lenox hasn't had for a while. But you know what? This is where you really test yourself, and you want to get yourself in good position to make a run at the end of the year.
Moving to 11B, as we mentioned, West Central losing to Winter. And let's talk a little bit more about that game. Not only did Winter defeat West Central, it was a 28-0 shutout on the road, and Winter does what they do best, run the darn ball.
71 plays, 71 runs.
Yep.
70 runs, I think, were inside the tackles, according to Aiden Barfus. And no runner went over 100 yards. No play went over 20 yards. They just pounded the ball down the field.
Dinked and dunked down the field the whole game.
Right through the middle. And they've thrown 5 passes on the season. So right now they have more wins on the season than pass attempts. And that's how Winter will beat you. They will just get up in your face. And that's what we wondered early in the year. Are they as physical as they have been in the past? Well, they showed it against West Central that they are.
Absolutely. And when we look at seeding scenarios, we've talked about it. 11B is the biggest class in South Dakota. There's 29 teams. You get 16 that make the playoffs. So their playoffs are going to start a week early along with the 9-man schools. But a lot could happen. Winter is pretty clearly the #1 team and will probably get that #1 seed. But then you got some other teams that could fight for that #2 seed. Some undefeated teams, some teams that have maybe flown under the radar a bit.
The Dual Cardinals could have that first undefeated season like we talked about since 1989. They should have a game against Redfield this week. If they do, they're in the driver's seat to take that #2 seed, which people are like, whoa, where'd that come from? Well, they've been winning all season long. Sioux Valley would actually, seed point-wise, would get that 3rd seed, which could be huge come semifinal weekend if those 2 teams square off against each other. So there's still another undefeated team in Woonsocket, Wessington, Springs, Sanborn, and Central. They play Rapid City Christian, their toughest opponent of the year. Here in the last week, if they stay undefeated, they will be a top 4 team, which makes them automatically dangerous. But there's so many other good teams in that 5 through, 11 or 12 range that this playoffs, don't look for chalk in this playoffs is what I'm going to say.
And here's an interesting part. Right now, the 8 seed is Tri-Valley, which could lead to a second-round rematch with Winter, who they took to overtime that first game of the season.
Multiple overtimes, yeah.
Multiple overtimes. That Winter won 8-0, and that was the game where we're just like, is Winter okay? Or did they just get off to, was it just a slow, sluggish start? That was clearly the case, but if there's a 1-8 rematch between Winter and Tri-Valley, that's going to be very interesting.
It'll be very interesting. Tri-Valley has a tough game this week against Wagner, who's in that top 8 right now. And if Tri-Valley can get a win, they should be able to avoid Winter in that second round. But again, that's looking way ahead. And there's just a lot of scenarios still to play out. But that's why it's fun to watch this last week of the season, because right on that cut line right now, you've got Groton, Parker, Webster, Clark would all be in. Mount Vernon, Plankinton, they would be just on the outside. And then Tripp, Delmont, Armour, a team could get themselves in. I think those are the teams right now that are really watching that. Are we in the playoffs or are we out of the playoffs in this last week?
Yeah, kind of that 13 through 18 seeding-wise right now. As you mentioned, Rapid City Christian faces Woonsocket, Wessington, Springs, Sanborn Central. Dells is at St. Thomas More. Bridgewater, Emory, Ethan at Elk Point, Jefferson. That's going to be a big one. Bridgewater, Emory, Ethan, they've kind of hovered in that top 5, fell off recently, but they're a potential 9, 10, 11 seed that could cause havoc.
Yeah, they've played a lot of close games this season. Right now, they're sitting at that number 10 seed. And last year, they had to go on the road and got beat by Hot Springs in the first round. A lot of people were surprised by that, but that's kind of the same scenario they are this year. They're going to probably have to go on the road in the first round of the playoffs. And
as you mentioned, probably the big one, Tri-Valley and Wagner, a couple teams in that lower half of the top 8 facing each other. Moving down the 9-man, Parkston just continues to dominate in AA. They've given up, 10 points all season?
10 points all season, and
That's
they
pretty good.
Do not play a cupcake schedule. Not saying that there's some teams in 9-man that do, but some have much easier schedules than others, and Parkston's not one of those. They've given up 10 points on the year. They have earned that number 1 seed, and they're watching at home with their bye week coming up this week.
Right now, based on current seeding scenarios, Wall would actually be number 2. But again, with so many teams in 9AA, there are some different scenarios that could play out over this last week.
And very quietly, we talked about how quiet Platte Geddes has been all season with all these close games that they've been playing. But if they win in this last week of the season, I did the seed points, and they would actually more than likely jump, because there's all kinds of other records that could affect the point season. But for the most part, they would be able to jump Wall into that number 2 spot in 9AA, and you want to be a 1 or a 2. That gets you home field throughout the playoffs. And Wall, even though they lost to Phillip earlier this year, has a chance to get that.
And then looking at kind of the area of making the playoffs, not making the playoffs. Right now, like 14 through 19, you got teams like Bonham, White River, Dupree, Viborg, Hurley, Bennett County, Great Plains Lutheran. Yeah,
exactly. And I think for me, if Bonham goes against Gregory and gets an upset win, that will go a long way for them to make sure that they make it into the playoffs. Dupree and Viborg Hurley are sitting at home done, hoping that things shake out their way with the way these other teams go. So they're watching scoreboards on Friday night for sure. And Great Plains Lutheran has a chance to punch their ticket too against a Hitchcock-Tulare team that has gotten blown out a couple of times this year. So maybe have a chance to surprise some people with a surprise win to get into the playoffs themselves.
And then when it comes to 9A, Warner should be able to wrap up the number 1 seed. Their last game this week is against Northwestern, who has not won a game all season. And then just other seeding lines, again, in 9A, it goes 16 teams, and there's some teams right on that borderline. You mentioned a little bit ago, Coleman-Egan might be one of them.
Yeah, and Coleman-Egan, a team that won a state title not that long ago, right. They're trying to work their way back up. They would love to make the playoffs just to make a step up from where they were last year. Burke is in it, and they've got a game against Gave-O-Valin, which gives them a shot to secure a spot in the playoffs. And Waverly South Shore is done with the season, but hoping one of those 2 teams maybe slips up to give them a chance to get into the playoffs. And another one I'm just keeping my eye on is Dubrook, a team that has played extremely well this year, and I think is a little bit under the radar right now. They're sitting at that 7 spot right now. If they get a win against St. Mary, they could vault themselves up and really give some teams some trouble.
And then in 9B, right now, DeSmet is currently number 1. We've talked about Faulkton area all year, but DeSmet, they just got a big win on the road, as you mentioned, at Hitchcock-Tulare, which has struggled a little bit recently. But DeSmet playing Elton Lake Benton this week.
Yeah, and the way the DVC does it, they leave the last week open, the conference, and even though they're in different classes, they play for a conference championship. So we've got DeSmet locked up against Elkton Lake Benton, an extremely tough game going into the playoffs. And that could be good or bad for DeSmet, because that could knock them off that number 1 line and put them down. And if they do lose to Elkton, they're in danger of maybe that 2 or 3 spot, depending on how Avon does, because Avon has Woolsey-Wessington this week. So those people in DeSmet are cheering for Woolsey-Wessington to get a win so they can at least keep a 2 seed, which gives them home field throughout. But they would love that number 1 seed if they could somehow find a way to knock off Elkton Lake Benton.
Down the stretch we come.
Oh, a lot of good stuff.
Andera. As we mentioned, for most of these schools, in the 9-man ranks and in 11B, this is the last week of the regular season for them. Obviously for AAA, AA, and A, we're still going to have a couple more weeks of regular season football, but we're getting down to it.
It's getting serious, and this is the last Friday, full Friday of high school football. And next week we move to Thursday games, and the week after we have Thursday games before we finish up semifinal weekend on Friday again. So enjoy your Friday nights while you can. It's going to be chilly one out there, but a lot of good games. One other one I just have to mention is Canastota playing against Platte Geddes. We talked about Platte Geddes needing to win, but they go against Canastota. That's going to be a really fun one. Another one we'll be watching on Varsity Sports Live to see how that one turns out.
Bundle up, get your raincoats, enjoy your Friday evenings wherever you are in the state of South Dakota, because we will be breaking it down on Varsity Sports Live on Friday at 10:30. Us, Jody Norstead up in North Dakota, and then we'll do Football Insiders all again next week and talk about even more seeding scenarios, even more playoff scenarios as the high school football season reaches its zenith right now, Jason Andera.
Best time of the year. And let us know if we missed anybody, because we love covering everybody. If there's any interesting stuff you'd like us to talk about, we're always game.
And complain just to him, because he's the one who knows everything, or should know everything.
I don't.
Yeah, you do. You know a lot.
We have fun.
There we go. We have a lot of fun on Football Insiders. For Jandy, I'm Brownie. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on VSL on Friday and Football Insiders next week.